They say every state has its shadow. But what about Maryland? Maryland holds top secrets that should stay buried. Tonight we're unveiling 3 stories locals would rather forget. Stories of real people in real places right here in the old line state. These aren't fairy tales. These aren't urban legends passed down from generation to generation. These are the kind of stories that will make you double-check your locks before bed. The kind that will make you wonder what's really watching you from the darkness outside your window. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't watch this alone. Because once you hear about what happened in Maryland, you'll never look at the Chesapeake Bay, the Misty Mountains, or even your own neighborhood the same way again. Ready? Let's get started. I'd love it if you subscribed right now before we get started. Story 1. The Thing in Blackwater Refuge. The Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge sits on Maryland's eastern shore, a sprawling maze of marshlands and twisted waterways where the land doesn't quite know if it wants to be solid or liquid. It's beautiful during the day, with its endless stretches of cord grass and the occasional eagle circling overhead. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. Marcus Webb was a wildlife photographer who'd spent 3 years documenting the refuge. He knew every trail, every blind, every secret spot where the light hit just right at golden hour. His Instagram was filled with stunning shots of marsh sunsets and rare bird species. What it didn't show were the photos he deleted, the ones he took that last night in October 2019. Marcus had planned an overnight shoot to capture the autumn migration. He'd done it dozens of times before, setting up his camera equipment in one of the observation towers deep in the refuge. The rangers knew him by name. They'd stopped checking his permits months ago. He was practically part of the furniture. That evening, everything seemed normal. Marcus hiked in around 7 p.m., his backpack loaded with camera gear, water, and enough granola bars to last until morning. The sun was already sinking, painting the marsh in shades of orange and purple, perfect conditions. He reached the tower just as twilight settled over the refuge, climbed the wooden stairs, and set up his tripod. The first few hours passed uneventfully. He captured some decent shots of geese flying in formation against the darkening sky. Around 10 p.m., the wind picked up, making the marsh grass hiss and sway. Marcus loved this sound. He told friends it was like the earth breathing. That night, though, something about the rhythm felt off. It wasn't quite steady. It would pause, then rush, then pause again, like something was disrupting the pattern. He checked his camera's viewfinder, scanning the marsh below. Nothing but darkness and the occasional reflection of moonlight on standing water. He adjusted his lens, increasing the exposure time to capture more light. That's when he saw it. At first, Marcus thought it was a heron. The shape was roughly the right size, standing in the shallow water about 50 yards from the tower. But herons don't stand perfectly still for 20 minutes. They shift, they hunt, they move. This thing didn't. It just stood there, facing the tower, facing him. Marcus zoomed in and took a photo, the shutter clicking loud in the silence. The flash illuminated the marsh for a fraction of a second. In that brief moment of light, Marcus saw that whatever was down there was definitely not a heron. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, but its proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long and bent at odd angles, like they had extra joints. The body was humanoid but emaciated, with arms that hung down past where the knees should be. And the head, God, the head, it was smooth and featureless, tilted at an angle that made Marcus's neck hurt just looking at it. He pulled his eye away from the viewfinder, heart hammering. When he looked back at the marsh with his naked eyes, he couldn't see anything. Just darkness. Just the normal sounds of the refuge at night. He was imagining things. He had to be. Maybe it was a dead tree he'd never noticed before and the shadows were playing tricks. Marcus looked back through his camera, adjusting the focus. The thing was closer now. It had moved at least 20 yards while he wasn't looking, and it hadn't made a sound. No splashing, no rustling of grass. It was just there. Closer. Still facing the tower. That's when Marcus made his first mistake. He called out, "Hello? Someone down there?" The refuge is closed." His voice echoed across the marsh and died away. Silence. Then, from somewhere much closer than where the thing had been standing, he heard a sound. It started low, like the creaking of an old door, but it rose in pitch until it became something between a wheeze and a whistle. It set Marcus's teeth on edge and made his stomach turn. That was not a sound anything natural should make. He grabbed his phone, hands shaking, and tried to call the ranger station. No signal? Of course there was no signal. He was in the middle of a wildlife refuge. He tried anyway, holding the phone up, waving it around like that would somehow make the bars appear. Nothing. When Marcus looked back at the marsh, the thing was at the base of the tower. He hadn't heard it approach, hadn't heard the stairs creak, but when he pointed his flashlight down, he saw fingers. Too long, too thin, too many joints, gripping the edge of the platform below him. He did the only thing he could think of. He ran. Marcus grabbed his backpack and bolted down the stairs on the opposite side of the tower. He didn't look back, didn't check to see if it was following. He just ran through the marsh, his boots splashing through water and sucking in mud, branches whipping his face in the darkness. His flashlight beam bounced wildly, revealing nothing but endless grass and water. The wheezing sound followed him. Sometimes it was close, right behind him. Sometimes it echoed from far away. Sometimes it came from multiple directions at once. Marcus ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. When he finally burst out onto the parking lot near the visitor center, he collapsed next to his car, gasping and sobbing. He never went back for his camera equipment, never returned to the refuge at all. When rangers found his gear 3 days later, the tower was empty except for his camera. The memory card was still inside. They looked through the photos, curious about what had spooked the experienced photographer so badly. Most of the images were normal, birds, landscapes, the usual stuff. But scattered throughout were other photos, dozens of them, all taken after the timestamp when Marcus said he'd fled. Someone or something had kept taking pictures throughout the night. Photos of the empty marsh, photos of the stairs, photos pointed up as if something was climbing. And the last photo on the card, taken at 4:47 a.m., was a close-up shot. Perfectly in focus, crystal clear. It was the tower platform where Marcus would have been standing if he'd stayed. The rangers gave Marcus his camera back. He sold it the next day without looking at the photos. He moved to Delaware a week later and never spoke publicly about what happened. But sometimes, on his new Instagram account, you can see him posting pictures, still nature photography, still beautiful, but never, ever anything from a marsh. And if you look carefully in some of his recent photos, in the backgrounds, just at the edge of the frame where the shadows get deep, sometimes there's a shape. Tall, thin, watching. If you're enjoying these Maryland horror stories, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for the next one, because what happened in Antietam is even worse. Story 2. The Soldiers Who Never Left Antietam. Antietam National Battlefield is sacred ground. On September 17, 1862, it witnessed the bloodiest single day in American history. Nearly 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing in just 12 hours of fighting. The cornfields were so soaked with blood that they turned black. The sunken road was piled so high with Confederate dead that it earned a new name, Bloody Lane. That much death leaves a mark. Everyone knows Antietam is haunted. Park rangers, visitors, even skeptics have reported seeing ghostly soldiers marching through the fields, hearing phantom drums and gunfire. These stories are so common that the Park Service doesn't even bother denying them anymore. But most of these encounters are benign, residual energy, echoes of the past. Most, but not all. In July 2017, a group of Civil War reenactors got permission to camp overnight on the battlefield for a private event. There were 12 of them, all experienced reenactors who'd spent years perfecting their uniforms and studying the battle. They weren't ghost hunters. They weren't looking for trouble. They just wanted to spend a night on the hallowed ground, maybe get some atmospheric photos for their group's website. They set up camp near the Dunker Church, the small white building that had been a focal point of the morning's fighting. By all accounts, it was a pleasant evening. They cooked over a campfire, shared stories, and watched the sun set over the fields where so many had died. Around 10 p.m., they decided to do a night march, carrying period-accurate lanterns and walking in formation down the same roads the Union troops had used. That's when Tom Hendricks noticed the other group. At first, he thought they were local reenactors who'd come to join them. The figures were wearing Union uniforms and carrying rifles, marching in loose formation about 100 yards away. Tom was annoyed. Their permit was for a private event, but he figured they just explained the situation and the newcomers would leave. He called out to them, "Hey, this is a private event tonight." The figures kept marching. They didn't acknowledge Tom at all. They just walked steadily toward the tree line near Bloody Lane, their formation surprisingly tight for what Tom assumed were amateurs. "Hey!" Tom called again, louder. Still nothing. He turned to his friend, Marcus Reynolds. "Go tell those guys they need to leave. We've got the permit tonight." Marcus jogged toward the group, his lantern swinging. Tom watched him get within about 50 feet of the other reenactors before Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. He stood there for a moment, completely frozen, then turned and ran back to the main group faster than Tom had ever seen him move. "We need to leave," Marcus gasped when he reached them. His face was white, eyes wide. "Right now. We need to leave right now." "What's wrong? Who are those guys?" "Those aren't guys," Marcus said. "Their feet aren't touching the ground." The group laughed nervously. Tom grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the marching figures. The bright LED beam cut through the darkness and revealed nothing. The figures were gone. Tom swept the beam back and forth. Empty fields, no one there. "See?" someone said. "You just psyched yourself out. It's a creepy place at night." But Marcus wasn't convinced. Neither was Tom. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. The group decided to head back to camp, cutting their night march short. As they walked back toward the Dunker Church, Tom kept glancing over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Back at camp, they tried to settle in for the night. Most of the group bedded down in period-accurate bedrolls, though a few had smuggled modern sleeping bags in their cars. Tom was still too wired to sleep. He sat by the dying fire, watching the darkness beyond the ring of light. Around 1 a.m., he heard singing. It was faint at first, just barely audible over the wind. A dozen male voices, maybe more, singing Battle Hymn of the Republic. The sound was coming from the direction of Bloody Lane. Tom stood up, grabbing his lantern. "Hey, wake up! Someone's out there!" The others groaned and stirred. Marcus sat up immediately. "Tell me you don't hear singing." "I hear it," Tom confirmed. The singing was getting louder, closer. Tom could make out individual words now. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Then the smell hit them. It came on suddenly, overwhelming. The stench of gunpowder and blood and something worse, something rotten, something that had been dead in the sun for days. Half the group started gagging, and 2 people ran to the tree line to vomit. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by screaming.
The sound of thousands of men screaming in agony, all at once, coming from every direction, screaming in pain, screaming for help, screaming for their mothers. The sound was so loud that Tom dropped his lantern and clutched his ears, but it didn't help. The screaming wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside his head. Later, Tom couldn't remember exactly how they got out of there. He had flashes of memory, running through the darkness, falling over tent stakes, someone crying, the sound of cars starting. The next clear thing he remembered was sitting in a Denny's parking lot 20 miles away, trying to stop shaking long enough to hold a cup of coffee. The group compared notes. Everyone had experienced the same things: the smell, the screaming, and something else. In those last moments before they fled, when the screaming was at its peak, all of them had seen figures surrounding their camp. Dozens of them. Soldiers in tattered uniforms, some Union, some Confederate, all of them wrong somehow. Faces too pale, eyes too dark, and all of them reaching toward the reenactors with hands that ended in broken, blackened fingers. They reported the incident to the Park Service the next morning. The ranger who took their statement was sympathetic but unsurprised. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "We had to ban overnight camping in that area. 3 other groups reported the same thing. Whatever's there, it doesn't like visitors after dark." "Why didn't you tell us?" Tom demanded. The ranger shrugged helplessly. "Would you have believed us? Everyone thinks they're different. Everyone thinks they can handle it. Everyone thinks they want to experience something supernatural. Until they do." Tom's group never went back to Antietam. Most of them quit reenacting altogether. But the worst part came later. 3 members of the group, including Marcus, started having nightmares. The same nightmare, every night. They're back at Antietam, at the camp, and the soldiers are coming closer. The screaming is building. The smell is overwhelming. But this time, they can't move, can't run, and the soldiers keep reaching with those broken, blackened fingers. Marcus tried everything. Therapy, medication, sleep studies. Nothing helped. The nightmares continued every single night for months. Then suddenly, they stopped. Marcus called Tom, relieved. "They're finally gone," he said. "I'm free." Tom was happy for his friend, but that night, Tom had a dream. He was at Antietam, at their campsite. Marcus was there too, standing in the circle of tents. But Marcus wasn't looking at Tom. He was staring toward Bloody Lane, where the soldiers were forming up in ranks. And when Marcus turned around, his face was too pale, his eyes were too dark, and all of them reaching toward the reenactors with hands that ended in broken, blackened fingers. The next morning, Tom called Marcus's phone. It went straight to voicemail. He called Marcus's wife. She said Marcus had left the house at midnight and hadn't come back. He'd left a note saying he needed to finish what we started. The Park Service found Marcus's car in the Antietam parking lot 3 days later. He was never found. The search dogs tracked his scent to Bloody Lane, then lost it completely, like he just vanished into thin air. Or into history. Sometimes people visiting Antietam report seeing an extra reenactor mixed in with the park's official programs. A man in a Union uniform who stands a little too still, whose face is a little too pale, who never speaks or breaks character. When approached, he just points toward Bloody Lane and smiles. The park rangers know who he is, but they don't talk about it. Because if they acknowledge that Marcus never really left Antietam, they'd have to admit what that means. They'd have to admit that the battlefield doesn't just echo the past. Sometimes it adds to it. One soldier at a time.
Still with me? Good. Because this last story, this is the one that kept me up at night. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. You're going to want to hear what we cover next week. Trust me on this. Story 3. The Cabin. Savage River State Forest in western Maryland is remote, like genuinely remote. Over 54,000 acres of mountains, streams, and dense forest where cell phone signals go to die. It's the kind of place where you can hike for hours without seeing another soul. The kind of place where the trees grow so thick that even at noon, the forest floor stays in perpetual twilight. It's popular with hikers and hunters who want to get away from civilization, who crave that feeling of true isolation. And most of them have no idea about Cabin 391. The cabin isn't on any official Forest Service maps. It's not marked on trails. There are no coordinates listed in any database. If you tried to look up its history, you'd find nothing but dead ends and redacted files. Because officially, Cabin 391 doesn't exist. The Forest Service demolished it in 1993 and erased it from their records, going so far as to remove every reference to it from their archives. But if you know where to look, if you hike deep enough into the forest along an old, overgrown trail that splits off from the Lost Land Run Trail around mile marker 7, you can still find the concrete foundation where it used to stand. Moss-covered, crumbling, empty. And if you're unlucky enough to be there after dark, you might find more than that. Sarah Chen was a wilderness guide who ran solo backpacking trips through Maryland's state forests. She'd been doing it for 8 years, had led over 200 successful trips, and prided herself on never having a single incident. She knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Every trail, every water source, every shelter. In November 2016, she was leading a 3-day trip for a client named David Ross, a tech executive from Baltimore who wanted to unplug and reconnect with nature. David was in his mid-40s, recently divorced, and desperately needed a break from the constant notifications and board meetings. It was supposed to be routine. Sarah had done this exact route 100 times. On the second night, they made camp about 6 miles into the forest, in a small clearing near a stream that Sarah had used dozens of times before. The weather was perfect. Cold but clear, with a sky full of stars visible through the bare branches overhead. They had a good day of hiking. David was tired but happy, already talking about booking another trip in the spring, maybe something more challenging. Everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. David had finally stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes, accepting that there was no signal out here. He had started to relax. They ate freeze-dried meals heated over Sarah's camp stove, shared stories about past adventures, and watched the fire burn down to embers. Around 9 p.m., David asked if they could take a short night hike. He was an amateur photographer and wanted to try some long exposure shots of the stars through the trees. Sarah agreed, though she warned him they couldn't go far from camp. They grabbed their headlamps, made sure the fire was completely out, and followed the stream, walking slowly in the darkness. The night was beautiful. Peaceful. The stream gurgled softly beside them, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. Their headlamps created small pools of light that danced across the forest floor. David was already composing shots in his mind, talking excitedly about aperture settings and ISO levels. Sarah half listened, more focused on making sure they didn't wander too far. That's when they found the trail. It appeared suddenly on their left, a gap in the undergrowth that Sarah could have sworn wasn't there on their hike in. It wasn't marked on Sarah's GPS. She'd never seen it before, and she thought she knew every inch of this section of forest. She pulled out her phone, checking her offline maps. Nothing. The trail was old, overgrown with ferns and brambles, but clearly man-made. Someone had cut this path deliberately, probably decades ago. It headed uphill, away from the stream into dense forest where the trees grew so close together that their headlamps barely penetrated the darkness. "Where does this go?" David asked, his photographer's curiosity piqued.
"I don't know," Sarah admitted, and the fact that she didn't know bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "It's not on any map. Probably an old logging road from the 50s or 60s. They used to log this area pretty heavily. They should have turned back." Sarah knew that. Every instinct she'd developed over 8 years of guiding screamed at her to return to camp. But she was curious, and David was excited about getting deeper into the woods for his photos. The trail looked stable enough, and they had plenty of time before they needed to sleep. So they followed the trail, telling themselves they'd only go a few hundred yards, just see where it led, and then turn back. The trail climbed steadily uphill, winding between ancient oaks and maples. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing thicker, the undergrowth more dense. After about 10 minutes of walking, Sarah noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest had stopped. No wind rustling leaves, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush, no insects, just their footsteps and breathing, echoing slightly in the stillness. "You feel that?" David asked quietly. He'd stopped walking, his head cocked to one side. "It's quiet." "Too quiet," Sarah agreed. She was about to suggest they turn back when the trail opened up ahead of them. The clearing appeared suddenly, an almost perfect circle, about 30 feet across. The trees formed a ring around it, their branches bent inward as if deliberately avoiding the space. And in the center of the clearing, there was a cabin. It was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, built from rough-cut logs that were dark with age and moisture. There were 2 windows, both broken, with jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frames. The door hung open on rusted hinges, swaying slightly despite the complete lack of wind. The whole structure leaned slightly to one side, like it might collapse at any moment. But that's not what struck Sarah immediately. What struck her was how wrong it felt. The clearing was too quiet, too still. The air itself felt different here, heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on them. No wind, no insects, no animals. Just silence. And something else. A smell. Faint but unmistakable. Like old paper and copper and something rotting. "Cool," David said, raising his camera. "This is perfect. Great find, Sarah. This'll make an incredible shot." "We shouldn't be here," Sarah said. The words came out automatically, unbidden. She didn't know why she said them, but every instinct was screaming at her to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. "Come on, it's just an old cabin," David said. He was already walking toward it, his camera up, framing shots through the viewfinder. Probably a hunter's shack from the 70s or something. Maybe a fire lookout station. This is exactly the kind of authentic wilderness experience I was hoping for. Sarah followed reluctantly, her hand resting on the bear spray at her belt. Not that bear spray would help against whatever was making her skin crawl. As they got closer, she noticed more details that didn't make sense. The cabin had no chimney, no pipe for a stove, no outhouse nearby, no well. What kind of cabin had no water source or heat? And the logs, now that she looked closely, they were covered in scratches. Thousands of them, deep gouges in the wood carved with such force that splinters jutted out from some of the marks. Some marks were old and dark with age, almost black. Others looked fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and raw. They weren't random. They were organized, groups of 5, the 5th mark crossing the other 4 diagonally. Someone was counting for a very, very long time. "Someone's counting days," David whispered. His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. "It's like a prison sentence."
Jesus, how many are there? Sarah's mind was racing, calculating. If each group was 5 days, and there were, she couldn't even estimate. The walls were completely covered. "More than anyone could count in a lifetime," she said quietly. That's when she noticed the chair. It wasn't dusty. It should have been covered in years of accumulated grime and cobwebs. But it looked clean, recently used. And there on the seat were fresh scratches in the wood, as if someone had been sitting there, clawing at the armrests. "We're leaving," Sarah said. "Right now." "Wait, let me just get a few photos." David raised his camera. "Now, David." Sarah grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the doorway. She didn't know why, but she was absolutely certain that going inside that cabin would be a mistake they wouldn't come back from. "We're leaving. This place isn't safe." "What? Why?" David looked at her, confused. But then he saw her face, saw the genuine fear in her eyes. Okay, we're leaving." They hurried back down the trail toward their camp. Neither of them spoke. David didn't complain about cutting the excursion short. He'd felt it too, that wrongness, that sense of being watched, the feeling that the cabin wanted them to come inside, to sit in that chair, to start counting. They were about halfway back when they heard the sound behind them. Footsteps. Running. Not jogging, not walking quickly, running at a full sprint, coming from the direction of the cabin, moving fast through the brush, branches snapping, leaves rustling. And the footsteps weren't trying to be quiet. They were heavy, deliberate, getting closer. Sarah and David ran. They didn't discuss it, didn't even look at each other. They just ran, their headlamps bouncing wildly, branches whipping their faces. Sarah's backpack bounced painfully against her spine. David's camera banged against his chest. The footsteps kept pace behind them, sometimes falling back, sometimes getting closer. And underneath the sound of running, Sarah heard something else, something that made her blood freeze. Someone was counting. A man's voice, hoarse and desperate, the words coming out in ragged gasps. 1,643, 1,644, 1,645. The voice was broken, raw, like someone who'd been screaming for hours or years. They ran faster. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs screamed, but the counting continued, never stopping, never slowing. 1,646, 1,647. The numbers climbed higher and higher,
each one pronounced with terrible precision despite the ragged breathing. They burst into their campsite, gasping. Sarah grabbed her satellite phone, the one piece of technology she always carried for emergencies. Her hand shook so badly she almost dropped it. Behind them, the footsteps had stopped at the edge of the clearing, but the counting continued, echoing through the trees. Louder. Closer. 1,652. 1,653. David was frozen, staring into the darkness beyond their campsite. Sarah, there's someone out there. Don't look, Sarah said, fumbling with the satellite phone. Don't look at it, just don't. But David was looking. His face had gone white. It's standing right there, right at the edge of the clearing. It's not moving, just standing there and counting. The satellite phone finally powered on. Sarah called for an emergency extraction. Her voice was shaking so badly she could barely speak. The dispatcher asked what the emergency was. Sarah didn't know what to say. How do you explain this? Medical emergency. We need immediate evacuation. Savage River State Forest, coordinates. She rattled off their location. The dispatcher said a helicopter would be there at first light. 4 hours away. 4 hours, with that thing standing at the edge of the clearing, still counting. 1,659. 1,660. They didn't sleep. They couldn't. They sat back to back in the center of their camp, every light they had turned on. Flashlights, headlamps, even David's camera flash, anything to push back the darkness. The counting never stopped. Sometimes it was close, just beyond the ring of light. Sometimes it seemed to come from multiple directions. Sometimes it was so close that Sarah could hear the ragged breathing between each number. David was crying quietly. Sarah wanted to comfort him, but she couldn't move. She couldn't speak. All she could do was wait and listen to that terrible counting climb higher and higher. When the helicopter arrived at dawn, the counting stopped. Sarah and David ran to the landing zone, not even bothering to pack their gear. They just ran. The pilot asked questions. Sarah couldn't answer them. She just kept saying, "Go, please go." The Forest Service retrieved their gear 3 days later. Everything was there except David's camera. They found it inside cabin 391, the cabin that officially didn't exist, the cabin that had been demolished in 1993. The memory card was still inside. The photos were. They showed the inside of the cabin, the chair, the tally marks. But in several photos, there was something else. A figure, sitting in the chair, scratching at the walls. And in the last photo, taken at 4:47 a.m., the figure was standing outside their tent. Later, much later, Sarah did some research. She talked to old-timers who'd worked for the Forest Service back in the 60s and 70s. Most refused to talk about Cabin 391, but finally she found someone willing to speak. A retired ranger named Tom Hewitt, 83 years old, living in a nursing home in Cumberland. The cabin had been built in 1967 by a man named William Hartley. He'd legally purchased a small parcel of land before it was absorbed into the state forest. When the Forest Service tried to buy him out, he refused. He said he was conducting an experiment and needed absolute isolation. An experiment on the nature of time, on consciousness, on what happens when you try to count every moment of your existence. For 5 years, Hartley lived in that cabin. He had no electricity, no running water, no contact with the outside world. He'd brought in enough supplies for a year, and then nothing. Forest rangers would occasionally see smoke from his chimney, except, Sarah remembered with a chill, the cabin didn't have a chimney. In 1972, the rangers went to check on him. They found him dead in the cabin, sitting in that chair, a knife in his hand. The walls were covered in tally marks. The rangers estimated there were over 10,000 of them. Here's the thing, though. Hartley had only been there for 5 years. That's about 1,825 days. So what was he counting? Hours? Minutes? Seconds? The official report said Hartley had gone insane from isolation, but Tom told Sarah the truth that was redacted from the official report. Hartley's body was covered in scratches, and his fingernails were worn down to bloody nubs. And every single tally mark on the walls had been made with fingernails, not a knife. The knife found in his hand had never been used. It was still factory sharp. And there was something else. something that made Tom refuse to ever go back into that part of the forest. The tally marks were organized chronologically, starting at the door and moving around the room in a spiral. Tom had counted the marks near where Hartley's body was found. Based on their position in the spiral, Hartley should have made those marks around the time of his death. But there were tally marks beyond that point. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. Marks that covered areas Hartley's body never could have reached. The ranger who wrote the report noted one final detail before it was redacted. The tally marks were still fresh, as if they'd been made within the last few hours. And as the rangers were leaving the cabin, they heard something. A voice, faint but clear, counting. The Forest Service demolished the cabin in 1993, citing it as a safety hazard. They tore it down to the foundation and tried to erase it from their maps. But every few years, hikers report finding a cabin in that area. Some say it looks new, like it was just built. Others say it's falling apart. But they all report the same things. The chair in the center, the tally marks, the overwhelming sense that something is desperately trying to count its way to something. Freedom? The end? A final number that will let it stop? No one knows. And sometimes, hikers who get too close report hearing the counting continue long after they've left. They hear it in their sleep, in quiet moments, while driving home, while sitting at work. A man's voice, hoarse and desperate, endlessly tallying days or hours or moments that refuse to end. 1,653. 1,654. Sarah quit dadding trips after that night. She moved to Pennsylvania and took a job at a state park that was well developed, with paved trails and visitor centers. She never talked publicly about what happened, but on the anniversary of that night, she posts the same thing on her private social media every year. I can still hear him counting. The number keeps getting higher. Last year's post said he was at 4,829. That means whatever's in those woods has been counting for over 8 years since the night Sarah was there. 8 years, 2,920 days, 70,080 hours, 4,204,800 minutes. And it's still going. Still counting, still scratching marks into walls that may or may not exist. Still sitting in that chair, still trying to reach some final number that will never come. Because when you try to count infinity, you never stop. You just keep counting, forever. Maryland, the old line state, home to the Chesapeake Bay, historic battlefields, and dense forests. It's a beautiful place, but beauty can hide terrible things. The marshes hide things that should have stayed in the water. The battlefields hold on to soldiers who can never leave. And the forests keep counting, always counting, towards an end that may never come. These 3 stories, they're just the beginning. Maryland has dozens of dark corners, hundreds of whispered tales, thousands of moments where reality bent just enough to let something else slip through. And I'm going to find them all. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed diving into Maryland's darkest secrets, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Because next week, we're heading to a small town on the Eastern Shore where an entire neighborhood vanished overnight in 2018. The houses are still there, the cars are still in the driveways, but the people, they're just gone. And what they left behind is far worse than emptiness. Until then, keep your lights on, keep your doors locked, and if you ever find yourself in Maryland after dark, remember these stories, because the things that happened to Marcus, to the reenactors, to Sarah, they could happen to anyone. Sweet dreams. And if you found these stories as chilling as I did, drop a like, leave a comment with your own scary experiences, and subscribe for more horror content. See you next week, if you dare.